today's agenda. We'll cover, what is Lean Six Sigma, and then how does that translate to our Deloitte practice. Then we're going to talk a little bit about how does Deloitte kind of put their own little twist on it in terms of what we call the process intelligence offering, of which Process X-ray is one of the tools that we use within process intelligence. So cover a little bit of that, and then I always find it enjoyable to just bring it to life a little bit with a couple of case studies. So I'll run you through a couple of projects that I've done, and open up to questions along the way. If you want to stop me anytime, please do so. More than happy to address. We don't have to wait till the end. So starting off, just to kind of gauge the level of room here, who is, familiar with Lean Six Sigma just broadly? Okay, so pretty much everyone. Do we have any green belts or black belts in the audience? Okay, great. So for those of you that might not be as well versed in it, I'll quickly run through just some baseline concepts of what is Lean Six Sigma, and then dive a little bit deeper into what is it at Deloitte. So Lean, if you're familiar with Lean, that's really the Toyota production system. You may have heard it by that name. So that's really kind of where it gets its roots. It's really looking at elimination of waste. So waste from a material sense, so wasted product, wasted raw material, or also time and effort, energy. So it can be process related as well as related to the physical system. So elimination of waste, and then Six Sigma, that's really eliminating variation. So if you put these two together, you have a very powerful combination of eliminating waste in a very efficient way while also applying rigorous statistical control methodologies as well. So we'll move on to a little bit more deeper about Lean Six Sigma. So one of the concepts, again, is the elimination of waste. I'm not going to read through kind of all the examples, but just to kind of give you a flavor of how they categorize waste and ways to think about different types of waste. The most common that everyone kind of will immediately go to is inventory. A lot of times excess inventory is kind of a cure-all in almost any organization, right? If you have a problem with your manufacturing or distribution, just throw a little inventory there, and that'll kind of help smooth things out. So that's one of the most common areas of waste that we see is unnecessary inventory due to suboptimized processes. Some of the other ones are very easy to relate to are transportation. So unnecessary movement of goods. So if you're moving product between, let's say, distribution centers unnecessarily, or in one case, from one of my clients, they would literally fly product from China into the Midwest, put it in a different box, and ship it right back out to California. So it's just an opportunity to really streamline that process. So there's low-hanging fruit like that in many companies. Motion, so this one's more, if you think about a shop floor environment, try to make things as ergonomic as possible. You don't want to have a line operator walk a half a mile down to get a piece of tool, like a tooling, then walk, half a mile back. So it's another, keeping things, right place, right part, right place, right time, right? So you want to have everything at the point of use. Minimize unnecessary motion. Waiting, so anyone that's kind of familiar, this one I think really applies to more of a back office setting as well. We're all kind of guilty of it, I know I am. There are certain things you just don't really want to address, and you wait till you have a stack that's about this big, and then you just go through them all the time. I know for me it's my expenses, so I just let them sit, and then one day on Friday I just go through them all. Over-processing. And overproduction. Now these are kind of related, so overproduction is probably the more easier to understand. So you have it in terms of the macro level, right? So your annual demand is 100 and you produce 120 because you didn't have a very good forecasting process. Or you can also be, well, you built 100 and you needed 100, but you built them all on January 1 and you didn't necessarily have to build them all at the same time. You could have level loaded your production schedule. So two different ways to think about overproduction. Overprocessing, this is if you over-engineer something potentially, right? So you have this product, you make this pencil. No one cares if you make a pencil and it will last 100 years. You need it to last, they really don't care. They're not willing to, customers not willing to pay for that extra level of quality. So it's considered waste because if your end customer doesn't really care about it, then it's considered overprocessing. Defects also this is probably an easy one to relate to, right? So any sort of defect within the manufacturing process, or can also apply to back office. So if you don't get the right approvals, or it needs to get kicked back into, let's say, PO process can also be a defect in the process versus the product. So any questions, or anyone have any examples from their own experience that any of these just resonate with anyone in their day-to-day? I know. Sure, go ahead.
I used to work for Lucent Technologies, in which, in terms of transportation, this was the most laughable situation. So we had a customer in Japan, and we manufactured the base station, the actual physical box that's underneath these tall cellular towers. We manufactured the cabinet in New Hampshire. The electronics was put in Japan. So we shipped the cabinet over to Japan to put the electronics in. But then we had to logo it in the US. So we shipped the cabinet. These are a 1,200-pound cabinet to New Jersey to logo it, and then do final test and ship it to our customer in Japan.
Wow.
Yes.
So think about all that working capital just tied up on the boat both ways.
Right.
Yeah.
And you're damaging your transit.
Not to speak of the time this was.
Right. And the funny thing was, the Japanese, which was, this was Mitsubishi, we said, you know, you have to have 95% quality when you ship it over to us. And the funny thing was that they said, what do you mean 95%? That doesn't make sense. Why would I ever ship product that's only 95% quality product? So what they did was they actually shipped us a fully working cabinet, 100%, with 5 broken parts. Just to show us that it's 95%.
That's a perfect example. Yeah, that's.
And
Any
it
other
leads,
examples?
leads right into Six Sigma.
I have one, but it definitely tops mine, so I don't know.
Anyone else can compete with that? I don't know. Anyone, sure.
Yeah, I worked for a military contractor back in the 90s who they had a system in which the F-15 fighter required something called an FM frequency modulator, which was made by another very large company called General Dynamics, which was in Washington. So we would get the frequency modulators in our shop. We would validate that they were either out of calibration or needed repair. We would do the repair. Then we would have to ship it to Washington, the state of Washington, to be calibrated. And the problem was, every time we did this calibration, which was about $500,000, it would ship back, and because of the transportation, it would knock it out of calibration. So we ended up devising a way to stop that because it kept going back and forth. We never met our lead times, right? So we ended up setting up a shop and learned from GD how to do it ourselves. But it was quite an expensive situation. And it wasn't until there was a war effort that they were actually going to help us in setting up the calibration lab in our own facilities. Very expensive though. I can't tell you how many years and how many millions of dollars it cost the company.
Yeah, I had the opportunity to work for a defense contractor, very similar story. So a target-rich environment. For,
and the other thing we did is to make sure that they obeyed the fragile and handle it properly. We had to put a sensor on each of the products so that if we received it and we saw the sensor was activated, we knew it took a big hit. So we just immediately send it back and follow it through with insurance on the product.
Great example. Anyone else? I thought I saw someone.
I recently started the plant manager where I work, and the first week I just basically observed, stand in the circle type of thing, and over the next 6 weeks, basically moved all the raw materials back into production. The previous plant manager moved it all out. So everything's back to being point of use inventories and things like this, Kanbans. But the thing I find about all of the work I've done as far as lean is that it's all just very simple things. And the company's increased net profit by almost 350% in the last 4 months, just by doing all these, I'll call it menial improvements of just cutting down, walking around and keeping operators at machines and being able to thin down inventory, whatever it is. But it's amazing the impact that you can have with just very small changes. And I said, don't overlook the simple. Don't always look for the difficult stuff.
Right.
Solve all the simple stuff, and the big ones go away all by themselves. So,
Yeah, I've had a similar experience where you, just by talking to people on the ground day to day, they'll tell you. I mean, that's some of the best ideas I've gotten implemented were from people on the ground that said, I don't know why this is the way it's always been done, why don't we try it this way? And if you empower them and show them that you can actually implement and bring these up, it makes your workforce a lot more engaged because they feel like they have a stake in the game, and also you get the benefit of the operational improvements as well. So.
And Ron also does that physically, because I've seen him do a menial job himself to show everybody what needs to be done. And if it's important to him in his function in a managerial position, it resonates down below. That job isn't something that's menial, it's very important to the organization. And what he has done is changed really the plant from what I've seen in the last 3 months. It's gone from a cave in the Flintstones cartoon to a real good-looking plant with everything that has a place, has a purpose. There's a board up there that has suggestions from every employee to propose something that would improve the process. So yeah, like you're saying, we all have a chip in the game, and we're all playing. And it's really, really great to see that.
I've always subscribed to the walk a mile in someone's shoes so you can understand, because my mantra is, I don't want to ever hear from anybody you don't understand. So to me, even if you just do the job for a day to get the premise of what they're trying to accomplish, it can work miracles.
Yeah, there's really no substitute for that hands-on experience. Anyone else? If not, we can continue. Oh, thank you so much. So this is just a quick slide to illustrate the concept of variability, right? So if you're going to think who's the better marksman, the person on the right actually hit a bullseye, but the person on the left is consistently at a nice tight grouping, so maybe you change your sights a little bit and then you're dialed in. So just kind of illustrates that you don't necessarily have to be looking for bullseyes. It's more about how consistent you are with your execution. Along with that, so one of the key things that we practice within our Lean Six Sigma projects is this concept of founding DMAIC methodologies. So you can take this as rigorous or as situation independent, right? You don't want to make a mountain out of a molehill necessarily, but if you're asking yourself these questions in these phases, you're going to come to the right answer. So many of you probably might be familiar with these already, but define. So what problem are we trying to solve? What sandbox we want to play in? And if your core team can't get alignment with what that is, then don't go any further. But as soon as you get alignment on what problem you're trying to solve, it's how are we currently doing within that process? So what is our baseline performance? How are we going to measure ourselves? And how are we going to define success for the team? So starting to set up some goals. Analyze. This is the fun part. This is where people almost always try to jump to immediately without ever really understanding the problem. And this is where you identify the root causes of the issues that you're going to be looking at, and then trying to develop potential solutions to address those root causes. Improve. This is another one of the fun ones, but this is rubber hits the road. So you have your solutions in place. Now it's time to execute. So it tends to be a little bit longer, especially if it's not just process changes. If there's any sort of physical changes you have to relay out your warehouse or your manufacturing floor, those tend to take a little bit longer. But then finally, it's control. So this is where you're taking kind of a step back as an active project team and are just saying, hey, can this process, is it sustainable on its own without the direct involvement and oversight of the team? And then make any course corrections that you find at that point. And then it kind of starts a little bit, so it kind of goes through the continuous improvement process. So at that point, you can either kind of continue to refine or address the next highest priority problem that you have within the organization. Any thoughts or any questions on? Yeah.
In APICS terms, that kind of draws down to having better throughput for production. You're getting more product with less defects, or you're getting better quality. It's improving maybe lead time, improving maybe capacity.
Yeah.
We use that approach for our CAPA, so if something along, we follow this process to make sure that we get to the right cause and then develop a preventive action. And then we follow up with the monitoring and make sure it's working.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
But it goes through all these approval cycles, phases once it goes through, and then.
Yeah, that's a good point I didn't highlight, but each one of those we typically have a toll gate, or say we kind of get together with our project sponsors or the executive leadership and say, here's where we're at, here's what we think the problem is, what do you think? And then have a chance to kind of course correct at each point along the way. So you can either say, yes, this is still a valuable project to continue with, or okay, it's maybe scope it a little bit differently, or just keep going. But
And it's also on a formal system, so if someone's late or they're approaching the due date, they'll get a message in the email or so.
yeah, so
And
the
then-
controls are in place to
And
make
then
sure
it
that the
goes to,
process.
if they are late, it goes to their manager or director, whoever up above, so that there's a high visibility.
And basically, this is the same format as you would use in Kaizen.
Yeah,
Basically, what it is, it's just different terminology, but it's all the same steps.
yeah, and we don't try to get too hung up on the the letter of the law. Like as long as we're asking the right questions and kind of going through the same process, we are more than happy to tailor. I've used variations of this in several different clients, but as long as the right questions are being asked at the right time, that's really kind of the most important.
I'm wondering, do you have any techniques for defining? Because I do find people try to go to analyze, but they try to tell you that what's wrong first before to slow them down.
Yeah, so a couple ones that I've used a lot that are pretty helpful are just a simple project charter where you have, what is the problem statement? What is the, opportunity statement? And if you force them to sit down and fill out that charter, like what is our timeline? What are the expected benefits? Who should the core team members be? So if you kind of force them to sit down and no one leaves the room until we iron this out, that's, a good kind of tool to have. And then as well, in terms of scoping the process, another one that I like to use is called a SIPOC diagram. So it's an acronym. It stands for suppliers, inputs, process, outputs, and customers. So it forces you to kind of, like in maybe 5 simple steps, what is the end-to-end process that we're looking at? And it helps you kind of carve out the functional scope. And then once you've identified that functional scope, what are the inputs that go into that? The he said, she said kind of thing, and it kind of removes, the personal element to it and allows you to make, really objective decisions. So one part I really like about that, the Lean Six Sigma methodology, it's value stream focused. So it really, a lot of times, when we come into an organization that's having issues with execution, it's because it's very functionally focused, and they're kind of looking only within their 4 walls or their scope. They're not really concerned with the impacts, upstream or downstream from them. So an example, I was working for a furniture manufacturer in Michigan, and they would, in order to balance, there's good reasons why this was done, right? But they would balance their manufacturing, so constant every month. But in order to do that, they pull orders from 9 months ahead so that they could balance out. So if you look at the distribution center, they can't drive a fork truck through there because it's just stacked with inventory. So understanding, okay, yeah, there's some benefits and there's real dollars to level loading your production facility, but at least understand what costs you're driving down further in the value chain. So this kind of helps you take a more end-to-end view of.
One of the things that drives that is when you have inconsistent goals amongst different factions of the company. So you got, the finance is driving one thing, production's goal-oriented towards another. The guy in the warehouse is he's inventory driven. If you don't have a strategy that, everybody marches to, that's when you kind of have those kind of problems because, I want to optimize production. Yeah, well, I don't care about the guy in the distribution center. He's choking to death.
Right. Or procurement, they want, lowest piece price. And, manufacturing is saying, hey, I want this supplier. They consistently deliver the higher quality, on time, right when I need it. And there's those natural kind of friction points within an organization. You have to really, it's all, you're right, it's how you metric your organization, how do you incentivize your employees, and how do you create them so that it's not, mutually kind of oppositional. So it's, any other thoughts? But those are kind of the two things that I mean, yeah, it's value focused, so it's all about delivering value to the bottom line. There's things that can be done. One of the things that kind of differentiates, Lean Six Sigma versus, let's say, total quality management or TQM approach is that TQM is more of just pursuing quality for quality's sake. So a lot of times, most often, Six Sigma is almost like a misnomer because for most processes, generally speaking, you don't need Six Sigma level of quality. It's actually the customer's okay with having it, they would rather not have to pay that additional cost to get to that Six Sigma level and, deal with, mitigating through returns or something like that. So focusing on value is a big part of it. So understanding how it can you deliver bottom line results. And then the sustainability, so the continuous improvement aspect of it, it lends itself to, this is where the control phase comes in, making sure that once you leave, the project team kind of disengages, you have the appropriate controls in place so that if things start to revert back to the way they were, you have these exception-based reports or some sort of red flag that gets escalated to then re-engage the team and figure out what happened. So that's Lean Six Sigma more broadly. So one of the things that I'll spend a few minutes on is, how does process intelligence kind of differentiate itself from traditional, Lean Six Sigma programs? And I won't spend too much time. I'll try to catch up to get to some of the more fun stuff. But it's really all about getting down to, root cause analysis and following facts. So take a fact-based approach versus, more of the, like I said before, perceptions or thoughts about what the process is. So if you ask someone, how do you think it works, they'll might be one answer, but then you look at the data and you find something completely different. So traditional process improvement techniques, maybe just try to do the Band-Aid solution, right? You might see some of the issues popping up and you might treat that, but the underlying root causes of why that's happening continuously are left unaddressed. So it really gets down to the root cause. And this is the process intelligence methodology. It's rooted firmly within the DMAIC methodology. You'll notice some just a slight difference here. So scope and plan that very closely aligns to the define phase, assess the current state, again, kind of correlates pretty closely to measure. We did break out identifying opportunities and then design future state. So that was kind of both would be typically in the analyze phase, but we find it's actually helpful to have a checkpoint before you actually go into the design phase because you could have a portfolio of a dozen different project ideas, and if some of them are going to be non-starters for whatever reason, it's better to know that ahead of time before you put resources and time behind developing a solution to address it. So the design of future state, again, that's implementing developing the solutions, build and implement would correlate to the improve phase, and then control would be the sustain and optimize. And what we have here is just kind of an output from our value stream mapping tool. So process mapping generally is a very good tool to use for at a high level, but if you really want to understand what's going on within day-to-day operations, value stream mapping is really going to give you that next level of granularity. So this is where you're measuring process times, handoffs, and actually following the flow of information through the process.
And how do you deal with you get the design of future state? So you're trying to figure out, what do we want to be when we grow up, so to speak.
Yeah.
But while you're rolling out the front end of the process, with technology changing, especially like in the chip business where it's every 6 months something new comes out, where do you drive the stake in the ground to say, this is what we're designing the future state to be? Because by the time you get there, it's now 2 more steps further ahead of you.
Yeah, and that's a great question because one of my projects last year kind of hit that same work, looking at evaluating potential software solutions to address a transportation scheduling issue. And it seemed like every day we'd have a new vendor coming to us with a potential solution. And what we pretty much ultimately had to do was just say, we just kind of drew a line in the ground and said, here's what we've scoped in to evaluate. We understand this isn't a comprehensive list, but if after the fact, before we actually roll it out, we'll kind of do a quick survey just to make sure that we're still confident in whatever that is, and then just have rather than having it be an evergreen solution, have a project 2 years from now. So have some sort of cycle where you have to find the frequency of when you're going to relook at the question. And that kind of really depends on the payback of how much of an investment is it and how difficult would it be, like what's your switching cost to go to a different software solution. So one of the things that, so process intelligence really focuses on really heavy into analytics. So how can we use a lot of the new analytical tools that are coming out? So I don't know if any of you are familiar with companies like Tableau or Click or some of these providers that provide data discovery and visualization tools. Some of them are really easy to deploy relatively quickly, so you don't need to have a SAP team come in and spend however many years sometimes to install it. You can just take data extracts and then work with it there. So one of the things about that we developed at Deloitte is actually this process X-ray, and it's a data discovery tool which we take our Netherlands team actually developed this way to, it's basically an SAP extract. So if you think about the like the PO process or a sales order or anything really within order to cash or procure to pay, you can literally follow every timestamp through every event in SAP, and you can follow that through hundreds of thousands of transactions, and then you can visualize it in a very very intuitive and it's very easy to take terabytes of data and ultimately drill down into what are the handful of suppliers that are giving you issues, what are the handful of customers that are potentially giving you problems, or even down to people within your organization. You can measure throughput time across a number of different dimensions. So it's incredibly powerful. So I'm just going to walk you through some slides on that. But we've even received external kudos from Gartner saying it's a pretty impressive tool. And I wish I could do a live demo, but I have to be VPN'd in. But so I'll kind of just give you the high-level overview right now, so you can kind of see what your perceived process is. And it's not really showing up very well on that graphic, but it's rather than taking, okay, here's what we think the possible, how many permutations of the process are there, right? How many different paths through the organization can there be for this sales order or for this purchase order? And you might get an answer of, we think there's probably 10, 15, maybe. And then you actually look at, the extract of SAP, and it'll diagram out how many different paths there are. And it's usually, we did it on ourselves within our Netherlands practice. We thought we would have about 20. We had about 15,000. So that just kind of shows you, and you'd hope that, okay, well maybe there's 15,000, but maybe the top 10 or 20 represent 80%, right? The old Pareto principle. Sure.
What's the time frame that you used to?
We looked at a year's worth of data. I mean, you can define whatever you want, just more time, more data.
Bigger major.
Yeah. As long as you have the storage capacity, it's no issue though. The tool's handled up to several terabytes of data. So. Yeah. Sorry, I lost my track though. Pareto, yes. So we were looking at, taking a look at ourselves in the mirror from this perspective and saw how many different paths there were, and we would hope to see that 80% would fall in those 10 to 15, but we ultimately saw was it was much less than that. It was maybe like 15 to 20% were in those top 10 to 15 process paths. So you can kind of see some of the visuals here. It's hard to see, but we'll be quick through. I'll try to highlight some of the features. So up here, and it's hard in the back to see, so I'll just talk it out. But you'll have traces. So this is, think about a trace as unique from the start point to the end point. So that's the trail that takes through the organization. So we looked at 43,000 traces, and the spend here is 167 or so million, and using a period of a year. So you can kind of, and it tells you how many patterns there are, so how many unique patterns that information flows. And this is dummy data set. They wouldn't allow us to actually show our Deloitte data up there.
Right.
So they made us sanitize it, but I can tell you it was a lot more than 50. events, so these are actually the boxes. So this is, a process step within SAP. And just because I'm using SAP because that's the example that we have, but it's can be applied to Oracle and other ERP systems as well. Then users is how many people touch the process somewhere along the way. So you have visibility into that as well. And then the action trail here, this is kind of where it gets pretty fun. So you'll have, they call this the loaded business process. It's just the raw data dump. It's kind of the 100% of the pie. And then you can apply filters off of that, and we call that refinements. So you refine the context and say, okay, well, I only want to look at the top 50 patterns, or the top 10 users, or whoever, and you can kind of see the traces that correlate to that specific refinement.
As far as the people who touch the process, it looks like it was about 300 or something like that.
Yeah, 326 is up there.
Is it really 326, or could it be as little as, say, 100, because there's three shifts, and if it's going through the same process, it's just multiple people. Like if you've got 5 or 6 people shipping in the warehouse, different people touch different orders on different days. If it's tracking their initials or their date stamps and things like this, it could actually be giving you, let's say, more people than are really in the process.
You should be able to filter that by role, so.
It goes to, so if you have like a shared workstation where it's a common login, and SAP recognizes that as one seat, one person, then you lose some of that visibility. But most times, I have my login. Everyone has, so even if there are different people sitting at the same desk, if they're logging on, SAP knows that, okay, this is who's working on this, touching it right now. So it really would be, the 326 in this example. So good question.
The way you would address that, though, if you look at, say there's 326, but then look how many roles they represent.
That's what I'm saying. You want to break it down by role, because it could be 3 or 4, 6, 9 people in the same role. It's just who's committing the transaction.
The role represents
the variation of the process.
Not the person.
So what you can do in that situation is group things. So we can group users into, okay, here's our AP folks, here's our AR folks, right? And then you can filter based off of those functions. So it has the ability to group that. They can also group what we call traces, right? So there might be several traces, what we call first time right. So this is where it worked exactly as it was designed. It went through the process flawlessly, there's no issues with it. So you're going to want to know, so the first thing we do is understand, okay, what is your process? What would you consider a exception type of event? And kind of classify those into exception events and first time right events. And then that's where you can kind of baseline your best case, current throughput time is the way it's currently structured. Versus how much time, extra additional time, and that's how you can start to quantify and build a business case around if you're going to make any process changes. You can say, anytime, I'm just going to pick out one, anytime you have a sales order Incoterm change, that someone's got to go into the system and then change that. It might lead to some other, waterfall and other effects downstream, and it ultimately results into, on average, 7 days of extra process time. And then if you multiply that by, your working cap, how much it costs the capital is, you can kind of easily quantify, how much that process deviation is costing you. So this tries to kind of walk you through a example. So in this situation, we're saying, okay, we're going to take the sales order Incoterm change, and we only want to look at things that are traces that are going through that event. So we can apply one of those refinements. So now instead of looking at 100% of the pie, you're only looking at, let's say, 30% or however many go through there. And then you're able to kind of further downscope and look at, okay, so if you only look at the traces that go through there, and this isn't showing up very well at all, but rather than having that spider web of different patterns of potential, you'll notice that, okay, when this specific step is involved, these are the only events that are happening along with that sales order Incoterm change. So then if you want to take a look and say, okay, well, who's driving all of this? So you can kind of take a look and say, and there's some visualization options up here too, so you can chart out, by purchasing party, who the biggest offenders are. And you can take a look and say, okay, this, I can't read it, but this Rema store that's, for some reason, they're a repeat offender. And maybe it's just because they're your largest, if you had a percentage basis, this is fine, but maybe it's not. So you can actually take a look, click into that and refine that context further and say, of all of the, purchasing orders that came through them, who was working on them? Or let's get some actual examples to kind of bring it to life and figure out what are specific examples that happened. So once you refine the context down, you actually have individual traces, so individual transactions that you can pull up, and then you see the life cycle of that particular trace. So you can kind of follow through the timestamp to see who is doing what when. So you have your users over here, where then you can say, okay, I'm going to go talk to Jay Chapman and figure out what happened on this order to try to get that voice of the user experience. So it really kind of helps you isolate from potentially thousands, millions of transactions down to who are the what are the biggest opportunity areas for you in terms of scoping through how many traces go through the kind that's not the first time right category, but the deviations, and then from there try to drill down and figure out who the specific offenders are. So that's just an overview on Process X-ray. There's a lot of other tools that are out there that do very similar things. They often require you to do like an extract of data and then play with it in Excel and drop it on these tools on top of it, like Quick View, Quick Sense are great tools for data visualization, manipulation. Tableau, also good. And both of those tools are actually, if you want to just play around with it, get started quickly, you do the extracts, or you could layer it on top of you just point it to the tables in SAP or your whatever system you want to look at, and it can kind of reach in on a real-time basis to, so it's a dynamic system. So once you have it configured for whatever reporting you want to view, then you can just refresh it, dynamically shows how your business is doing.
Because you could lay it into the business intelligence, the data warehouse.
Yeah.
And then wouldn't be live. That wouldn't slow down. Because our systems, they're Oracle. We had to move to the warehouse, data warehouse, because